All right, guys, so in this section, we're going to talk about all the do's and don'ts about feeding raw bone. Feeding raw bone is one that I found that clients are very apprehensive about because there's a lot of myths surrounding them, and there's a lot of just apprehension around feeding bones in general because we've always heard not to feed bones to your dog growing up. At least I always heard that. But really the biggest thing is never to feed cooked bones. And when going into, feeding raw bones in general, let's go over the things that you should never do. And that's number one, never feed cooked bones at all. Cooked bones, once they're cooked, they become brittle, they don't digest properly, and they can cause bowel obstructions and a bunch of other issues. So cooked bones should never be fed. Cooked goes in line with smoked, so no smoked bones. I also don't recommend feeding any dehydrated bones. That's a bit, I don't want to say controversial. Some people are completely okay with feeding dehydrated bones. I personally do not. Once you dehydrate them, you do affect the composition of the bone. In my opinion, they do become brittle and difficult to digest. I personally had not great experiences feeding my dogs dehydrated bones. So for me, those are a complete no. Freeze-dried bones can be okay as long as they are soft poultry feet. So that would be the only time I would be okay with feeding any sort of freeze-dried bone if it's like a chicken foot or a duck foot. But other than that, raw bones only. No cooked bones, no smoked, nothing like that. The next don't would be no extremely dense bones. So I personally do not feed any beef bones at all. Beef marrow bones specifically are highly popular chews to feed your dog. But if you've ever given your dog a beef marrow bone, they're typically just licking the marrow out of the center and they're not consuming the actual bone. That's because any sort of beef bone is extremely dense because a cow is a huge animal. And so those bones need to be very dense to support, the weight of that animal. So you have to think that when you're feeding your dog something to chew on, and especially if they're an aggressive chewer and biting really hard on something, the way that friction works is that something's got to give eventually. And so if you're feeding your dog something that is more dense than the enamel of their teeth and they're biting down really hard on it, their tooth is going to break, not the bone. Whereas if you feed them bones that are softer than the dog's teeth, then if they're really crunching down on something, the bone will break. So I do not feed any beef bones. I do not feed any weight-bearing bones from large animals. So for example, for pork, I will feed pork ribs because those are not weight-bearing, but I won't feed any pork shoulder bones or femurs or anything where that's bearing the weight of the animal. I also don't feed weight-bearing bones for, again, any larger animal, mutton, elk, venison. Think of any large animal with really dense bones. You don't want to feed anything that is going to be harmful to your dog's teeth. Now, turkeys. Turkey is a kind of confusing one because nowadays turkeys are huge. So I don't feed any weight-bearing bones from turkeys. So no turkey drumsticks, but I will feed the necks and the wings. So that's your another big no. No large, dense, weight-bearing bones and no beef bones. If they're given recreationally, meaning the dog is not actually consuming the entire bone, it might be okay to feed a beef marrow bone or beef knuckle bone if the dog is just like licking it or just chewing on the outside, but you don't want to include that as the bone portion of the dog's diet because that can be really dangerous.